All right, everyone. So today we are discussing the influence of sport and exercise on health in infancy and childhood. Now, infancy and childhood are really important times for healthy development and learning. And generally, it's also thought that youth is an important time for establishing the foundation blocks of future well-being and health. So today we're going to start by going over the physical activity guidelines for all ages. We'll also introduce some important definitions, and over the next few weeks we'll look at adolescents, adults, and older adults. So today we're going to go through the guidelines and definitions that relate to all age groups in this part 1 here. Then we're going to look at the physical activity trends, specifically in children and infants now. And finally, we'll look at this pathway A and pathway B, which at the moment, it won't make sense to you, but it will become clear soon. So let's get into today's lecture. Okay, so here we're looking at the Australian government guidelines for physical activity and sedentary behaviour. Now, these are a set of recommendations that outline the minimum level of physical activity required for health benefits. They also outline the maximal amount of time that a person should be spending on sedentary behaviours to achieve optimal health outcomes as well. So different recommendations are made for preschoolers, so children aged 2 to 5 years old, compared to children and adolescents aged between 5 and 17. There's also different guidelines for adults aged 18 to 64, and then finally for older adults aged 65 and over, and you'll see those on the next slide. Now, these guidelines acknowledge that there's different amounts of physical activity that are required at various stages across the lifespan for maximal health benefits. And if we have a look at those aged 2 to 5 years old, this group includes those who are not yet in full-time schooling, so preschool-aged children. They're recommended to do around 180 minutes of physical activity per day, and this includes things like energetic playing in preschool. And there's also sedentary guidelines. So they shouldn't be restrained for more than 60 minutes at a time. And restrained, that includes things like being tied into a stroller, a car seat, or even sitting in a high chair. They're also recommended to do no more than 60 minutes of screen time, which includes obviously playing on the iPad, tablet, watching TV, and they don't have any strength recommendations. Whereas children aged 5 to 17 who are primary and high school aged children, they're told to do 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day, no longer than 120 minutes of screen time. They're also told to break up long periods of sitting, which is something that we're actually going to discuss a little bit later on. And they are told to partake in muscle strengthening activities 3 times a week. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean going to the gym and lifting weights. We're going to have a look at some of the muscle strengthening activities for children and adolescents within this age bracket soon. Now, for adults aged 18 to 64, the recommendation changes slightly, and we now see that physical activity is on a weekly scale. So it's a total of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity over 5 sessions per week. So that ends up calculating to around 30 minutes per session. Now, we're told to minimize and break up sitting periods and partake in strength activities 2 times a week. Now, for older adults, they're told to be active on most days, preferably all days, and their sedentary and strengthening and muscle strengthening guidelines are a little bit more obscure, with the recommendations just to be as active as possible and incorporate strengthening activities where possible. So it's important to remember that these guidelines outline the minimum amount of physical activities. So in most cases, more is going to be better. This is the minimum. So for most of us listening now, we want to be meeting that minimum requirement of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity activity per week. But what do we mean by moderate to vigorous intensity? So exercise intensity, it's measured by something called metabolic equivalence, or METs for short. You might have seen METs listed on exercise equipment on the treadmill or on a gym bike, or maybe mentioned by a personal trainer to help you measure your physical activity intensity. And basically they're a measure of metabolic cost. So sort of like a physiological benchmark used to track exercise intensity. So 1 MET is the energy that you spend sitting at rest, or it's your resting or basal metabolic rate. And this is equivalent to around 3.5 mils of oxygen per kilogram per minute. Now, an example of how we calculate these METs is an activity of 2 METs means that your activity level requires twice the amount of energy than it would if you were just sitting still. An activity with a MET value of 4 means that you're exerting 4 times the energy that you would if you were sitting still. So light, moderate, and vigorous exercise intensity is defined by how many METs it requires. So light intensity exercise is behavior that requires less than 3 METs, includes things like slow walking, cooking, doing chores around the house. Moderate intensity is activities that require 3 to less than 6 METs. And moderate intensity activities can be things like power walking, it's got doubles tennis here, or raking the yard. So a little bit more intensity there. And then finally, there's vigorous intensity activities, which are activities that require 6 or more METs. And this is your strenuous exercise. You're going for a run, cycling, going to F45 or CrossFit classes. These are the things that require 6 times more energy than what you would expend by just laying down or sitting down. And many adults do not do any vigorous intensity physical activity. Now, there's some other important definitions that we need to address related to our level of physical activity. So sometimes we'll be required to class someone's overall level of physical activity. And to do that, generally we use one of these 4 terms. If you've ever filled out an online energy expenditure calculator to figure out how many calories you should be eating in a day, they often ask you to describe your level of physical activity. So someone who is inactive is not getting any moderate or vigorous intensity exercise beyond activities of daily life. So this could be an example of someone who gets out of bed in the morning, drives an hour to work, sits at a desk all day, drives home, and then sits on the couch and watches TV until they fall asleep. Someone who's insufficiently active is doing some level of physical activity, some moderate or vigorous activity, but not meeting those minimum guidelines that we spoke about earlier. Someone who is active is meeting the guidelines. So for an adult, they would be doing between the 150 minimum and 300 minutes of physical activity per week. And if you're exceeding that 300 minutes, you would then be classed as highly active. So you're exceeding the physical activity guidelines, therefore being highly active. So something that you may be thinking to yourself now is, what about sedentary? Why isn't sedentary a level of physical activity? Well, sedentary behavior is a little bit different. It refers to any waking behavior characterized by a low level of energy expenditure, so less than or equal to 1.5 METs, and it occurs when you're sitting, reclining, or lying down. Now, there's a difference between a person who is sedentary and a person who is physically inactive. Being physically inactive means you're not doing any physical activity. In other words, you're not meeting those physical activity guidelines. However, being sedentary means that you're sitting or lying down for a long period of time. So a person can do enough physical activity to meet the guidelines, but still be considered sedentary if they spend a large amount of their day sitting down or lying down at work or at home or for study or for travel. Now, importantly, sedentary behavior does not include sleeping. Standing is another activity that has a low energy expenditure, but it's distinct. It's different from sedentary behavior in how it affects health. So standing up is not a sedentary behavior, even if you're standing still. Okay, so this figure illustrates the variation that can occur between individuals in the way that they balance their physical activity and their sedentary time. So if we look at the person with the white circles first, what we see here is a high volume of sedentary time with a spike in physical activity occurring around midday. So maybe they went to the gym after lunch. Now, this person could be characterized as a physically active couch potato. So they spend most of their day in that grey section, that grey sedentary level, but they do still do a session of physical activity. They still go to the gym and get their physical activity in. Now, this is in contrast to the active non-couch potato. This is looking at the black squares now. So this person with the black squares spends a high proportion of their day in light intensity activity, so between 1.5 to 3 METs. Now, both of these individuals participate in the same amount of moderate to vigorous physical activity. You can see that they both have a very similar spike at around that midday time there. And both of these people would be classed as physically active. However, the total energy expenditure and the time spent doing sedentary activities clearly differs between these two curves. In this next figure, we can also characterize patterns of sedentary behavior rather than just looking at total sedentary time. So this figure illustrates how the same volume of total sedentary time might reflect quite different behavioral patterns. So Person 1 and Person 2 in this figure both had the same total volume of sedentary time, but the way that they broke it up was different. In this figure, the prolonger, Person 1, is a person who would typically remain seated for a long period of time, whereas the breaker, Person 2, is someone who would move about more, stand up and move briefly during their seated activities. So they're not sitting for a long extended period of time, they're breaking up their sedentary behavior. Now, there's some evidence to suggest that the extent to which sedentary time is broken up is associated with biomarkers of cardiovascular and metabolic health, and this is independent of total sedentary time. So even though these two people had the same amount of total sedentary time, we could assume that the breaker is in better cardiac and metabolic health. So let's have a look at another example. Now, we know that total sedentary time is associated with poor health outcomes. The more time that we spend sitting, the greater likelihood of obesity, of abnormal glucose metabolism, cardiovascular disease risk factors. So this study of Healy in 2008 wanted to know whether breaks in total sedentary time were associated with those same negative health outcomes. And what they found was that even in people who had the same total amount of sedentary time, increased breaks in this time was beneficially associated with waist circumference and some other blood markers as well. So even if you're going to the gym and exercising every day, those prolonged periods of sedentary time can definitely have a negative effect. And you can see in the figure here that they divided the participants up into quartiles on how much, on the amount of breaks that they had in sedentary time over the day. And those with the most amount of breaks in the fourth quartile had a significantly lower waist circumference. So overall, These findings show us the importance of avoiding those prolonged, uninterrupted periods of sitting or lying down. And you might be asking yourself, why? Why does it matter if I sit for 2 hours straight if I'm still going to the gym afterwards? Well, it's quite interesting because we don't really know. The mechanisms underlying these findings, they're quite complex, and science doesn't really have a clear answer as to why this is yet. They've done some animal studies, and they've said a possible mechanism is that there's an impairment in the metabolism of fat and cholesterol in the body after prolonged inactivity. So overall, we see that it's not only the total amount of sedentary time which is important, but it's also the way in which it's accumulated. Are you a prolonger or are you a breaker? So being physically active, we know it's one of the most important actions that people of all ages can partake in to improve their health. And we know that the benefits of physical activity are vast and they're multi-systemic. So they're not only physical benefits, but also mental, emotional, and social benefits of exercise. A single exercise session, just one single session of moderate to vigorous physical activity, it can reduce blood pressure, it can improve insulin sensitivity, improve our sleep, reduce our symptoms of anxiety, and improve some aspects of cognition as well. Now, most of these improvements become even larger when physical activity is performed regularly. And other benefits such as disease risk reduction and improved physical function, these accumulate within days to weeks after consistently being more active. We also know that there's a strong relationship between sedentary behavior, physical activity, and all-cause mortality in adults. This figure here, it shows the moderate to vigorous physical activity on the x-axis and the daily sitting time on the y-axis. Red color represents higher risk of death, and green represents lower risk of all-cause mortality. And really, there's three main takeaways from this figure. First one is that high volumes of physical activity appear to remove the excess risk of death that's associated with high volumes of sitting. So if we're someone who sits a lot, we need to make sure we're someone who exercises a lot to counteract that as well. Very low time spent sitting reduces, but it doesn't eliminate the risk of the no physical activity. So if we spend our whole day standing up but didn't do any physical activity, we're probably not in the best spot we could be. We still need to include that physical activity in our routine as well. And given the high levels of sitting and the low levels of physical activity in most of the population, most people would benefit from increasing physical activity and reducing the time spent sitting as well. Now, this figure shows a conceptual model of how physical activity across the lifespan is beneficial to health. So physical activity, we know it has immediate and long-term health benefits. So this model is what we'll be following over the next few weeks to see how physical activity and exercise impact our health across the lifespan. So pathway A shown here signifies the influence of physical activity during infancy and childhood on the level of physical activity during adolescence. And it also shows the influence of physical activity during adolescence on physical activity in adulthood. Pathway B looks at the influence of physical activity in infancy and childhood on morbidity in infancy and childhood. Now, morbidity, it refers to disease or medical condition. Pathway C looks at the influence of physical activity in adolescence on morbidity in adolescence. D signifies the influence of physical activity during adolescence on adult morbidity, and so on. And then there's finally pathway F, which is looking at the influence of physical activity during adulthood on mortality, which is death during adulthood. So this figure will continue to reappear in this lecture and in subsequent lectures as we move through these periods of the lifespan. Okay, so those were the guidelines and the definitions that are important for this lecture and for the next few lectures. So let's have a look now at the trends in physical activity and exercise participation for Australian infants and children. So for reference, here are our guidelines again. We're going to start off by looking at those young children aged between 2 to 5 years old who aren't yet in full-time schooling. So this is preschool children. And the following data that's about to be presented is all from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report. And that report looked at how many children meet these guidelines. What they found was that around 6 in 10 children aged 2 to 5 meet the physical activity guidelines of 180 minutes of physical activity per day. Only 1/4 met the sedentary screen-based behaviour guidelines, and of these, only a total of 17% of children met both the physical activity and the sedentary behaviour guidelines. Now, there was no real difference between boys and girls for any of these measures in this age bracket. So there's definitely some room to improve in these areas. And if we have a closer look at what actually happens in those years between 2 and 5 years of age, we see that the proportion of children aged 2 to 5 who met the physical activity guidelines decreased as age increased. So we see here that 5 in 6 2-year-old children met the physical activity guidelines. However, this decreased to just 1 in 10 children aged 5. We see a very similar trend for the sedentary guidelines, with the proportion of children meeting these guidelines decreasing with age as well. Now, the average time per day spent on physical activities decreased as age increased, while the average time per day spent on sedentary and screen-based activities increased. So children aged 2 on average spent around 6.5 hours doing physical activity. However, this substantially decreased to around 2 hours per day for children aged 5 years old. Simultaneously, the average time spent being sedentary increased as children got older. Now, physical activity included time spent on outdoor as well as indoor physical activity, and the sedentary screen-based behavior included time spent watching TV, videos, playing video games, using the internet, and this excluded doing any sort of online homework or learning. So the average amount of time spent on physical activity and sedentary screen-based activities, again, was similar for boys and girls. Now, here are some of the most common sports for this age group. Most people probably wouldn't have guessed swimming as the number one. We sort of forget that all children, especially in Australia, need to learn how to swim, or most of them need to learn how to swim. So that's why that swimming is, significantly above any of the other sports in this age bracket. And the main barrier to participation for exercise is they're the wrong age. So often parents don't want kids to participate in sports thinking that they're too young to do so. Now, if we have a look at our guidelines again, we're going to spend the next few slides looking at older children, so 5 to 12 years. Now, these guidelines are for 5 to 17, but we're going to talk about adolescents specifically in a later lecture. So whilst these guidelines are the same for adolescents, the next few slides we're going to be talking about just 5 to 12-year-olds. They need to do 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day and no longer than 120 minutes of screen use. We also see here the inclusion of muscle strengthening activities 3 times a week. Now, 1/4 of boys and girls met the physical activity guidelines in this age bracket, and around 1/3 met the screen-based behavior guidelines. That ended up being around 30% of boys and 40% of girls. So we actually see that the boys in this age bracket are less likely to meet this guideline, meaning that they're probably being more sedentary, which is an interesting finding. Maybe it's the influence of video games or things like that that mean that there's a bit of a difference there between the sexes. Now, if we look at those who meet both guidelines, it's around 1 in 10 children. So definitely not many children who are meeting those two guidelines. And remember, those are the minimum guidelines as well. All right, so if we look at what happens with age, is there a difference between a 5-year-old and a 12-year-old? We see that there is actually a pretty significant difference. So if we're talking about meeting both guidelines, it's around 19% of children aged 5 to 8, whereas it's only 6% of children aged 9 to 12 who are meeting both those physical activity and screen-based guidelines. Now, if we have a look at the time spent on actual physical activity, it's similar for boys and girls at around 1.5 hours. And for sedentary time, we see just under 2 hours for girls and exactly 2 hours for boys. So a little bit of a gender difference there. If we have a look at some of the most common activities, we still see swimming at the number 1 position for 5 to 12 age range, but we do see the rise of a lot more team sports, football, soccer, AFL. We've also got gymnastics there, which is pretty high up as well. Similar for the barriers to participation, that number 1 barrier being the wrong age, and then we have not enough time coming into play as well, which is a big one for the adults. So here are our most common activities and the barriers. Okay, so here we've got a pretty big list of some basic examples of physical activity modes that can be classified as either moderate or vigorous intensity for children aged 5 to 12. So for moderate, things like bike riding, active recreation, so hiking, riding a scooter, or any sort of throwing and catching games. For vigorous intensity, we've got examples like running, anything with a run and chase, like playing tag, also jump rope, and then our team sports like soccer and basketball. Children also commonly increase their muscle strength through activities that involve lifting or moving their body weight. So they don't normally need any sort of formal muscle strengthening program like resistance training or lifting weights. However, we do know now that these programs are safe for children so long as they're properly prescribed and supervised. And we've also got some examples here of bone strengthening activities. So here we've got those high impact exercises such as running or anything with an element of jumping or hopping or even skipping. Okay, so a couple of key points from this part of the lecture. Very few children meet both the physical activity and sedentary based behavior guidelines. So 17% for those aged 2 to 5 and 12% in total for those aged 5 to 12. Adherence to physical activity and sedentary guidelines decreases with age. So as we age within this bracket, we become less active and more sedentary. There's no major differences between boys and girls, and the most common sport in this age bracket was swimming, and the most common barrier to participating in physical activity was being the wrong age. All right, so we've covered the guidelines and the trends in physical activity for infants and children, and now we're onto this pathway A of the conceptual model of how physical activity across the lifespan is beneficial to health. So here we see this pathway A again, and it's looking at the influence of physical activity during childhood on physical activity throughout the lifespan. So one of the many reasons that we promote physical activity in childhood is this idea that active kids are going to become active adults, therefore meaning that we'll live this healthier and fuller life if we're active in childhood. But do we really know if being an active kid means that we're going to be active in our adolescence and then in our adulthood? Now let's have a closer look at the stability of exercise behavior across the lifespan. So sporting schools, it's a $240 million Australian government initiative that's designed to help schools increase kids' participation in sport and connects them with, community sporting opportunities. The motto of this sporting schools initiative is encourages a lifelong participation in physical activity. Now, physical activity habits are assumed to develop during childhood through adolescence and into adulthood. And the promotion of physical activity interventions and physical education in schools is based off of this belief that physical activity is habitual and tracks over time. Active kids become active adults. But is physical activity really habitual? What do you guys think? Do you think that active kids become active adults? So these researchers wanted to understand the stability of physical fitness and physical activity from youth into adulthood. And to do so, they tracked 138 female participants across their life. What they found was that body weight was actually more stable than physical activity across the lifespan. So from youth to adulthood, they reported that 84% of normal weight girls were still normal weight in their adulthood. They found that 63% of overweight girls were still overweight in adulthood. Whereas when they looked at physical activity, only 54% of active kids were active adults, and 62% of inactive girls became inactive adults. Now, these results suggest that weight status during childhood is indicative of adult weight status. They also suggest that inactivity is more stable compared to activity. So if you're an inactive kid, you're likely to be an inactive adult. But if you were an active child, there's like a 50-50 chance that you'll be active as an adult. So overall, these findings actually don't strongly support the notion that active kids will become active adults. So is there anything else that we can do to help our children continue being active and follow that through into adulthood? So a few studies have looked at the characteristics of people who remain active from their youth and into adulthood. One of these classic studies was back in 1992, where they actually investigated the factors in childhood which predict high rates of participation in sport and exercise in later life. And they found that those who were most active in sport during adulthood were above average at sport in their youth. So they were the good sporting children. They had fewer health problems in childhood, and they were better educated. Now, these observations were further supported by another group of researchers who reported that high socioeconomic status and upward social mobility were associated with increases in physical activity from childhood to adulthood among over 2,000 Australian participants. So upward social mobility, it's defined as reaching a higher level of education compared to your parents. Now, this was associated with a greater likelihood of high physical activity in adulthood and high fitness level in adulthood. So there you go. To me, that was a pretty interesting finding and, not super intuitive, in that if you are better educated than your parents, then you're likely to be more physically active and fit. So you guys who are all at uni now, you're in a pretty good position. You might just have to do an honours degree or a PhD after this to beat out your parents. Okay, so we know that there's some factors that may influence the stability of physical activity across the lifespan. Socioeconomic status, being good at sport, education level. But this doesn't really entirely answer our question of why some people maintain physical activity over long periods of time while others stay inactive. Now, there are 4 hypothetical approaches to this issue, which we're going to discuss now. So firstly, we have the carryover value hypothesis, and this suggests that in adulthood, people continue to participate in the activities they engaged in at a young age. So the tracking of the same type of physical activity from school age to adulthood, and it's not actually been well studied today. So one group of researchers showed that adolescents who participated in endurance type sports, so this were things like cross-country skiing, running, cycling, had a higher probability of participating in the same kinds of activities 17 years later compared to non-endurance sports. So they suggested that these endurance sports tracked better than non-endurance ones. Now, in some activities, participation at a young age may increase the probability of participation in adulthood, but otherwise, adult physical activity doesn't really seem to depend on the type of activity or sport practice in youth. And that's because the typical activities practiced at a young age compared to the type of sports or activities participated in during adulthood, they're generally different. Another group of researchers found that playing soccer or ice hockey regularly in youth predicted high physical activity in adult males. However, not many of them continued to play soccer or ice hockey in adulthood. So these sports, by playing these sports, they were more physically active in adulthood, but they weren't necessarily playing the same sports. More recently, it's actually been suggested that the number of activities participated in during adolescence and childhood is more important for physical activity in later life compared to the participation in any type of specific sport. So basically, they're saying that by participating in more sports, you're more likely to be an active adult. So overall, this carryover value explains a part of the tracking from young age to adulthood, but it can't be the main explanation of why people have stability in their physical activity. Now, the second theory is the ability and readiness hypothesis. And this suggests that earlier experiences of physical activity or sport make it easier to maintain or restart physical activity after a break, even if that type of activity is different. So it's been found that those who have participated in physical activity or organized sport in youth for over 3 years are much more likely to be physically active in adulthood compared to those who were inactive at a young age or those who didn't participate in any type of youth sport. So these findings, they suggest that regular participation in sport or exercise results in the development of, important skills and motor abilities, attitudes, motivation, all of which are important for later physical activity. Third, we have the habit formation hypothesis, which says that people repeat the same behavior because it's a habit. Who's heard of, creating healthy habits? You've got to go out and exercise every day for at least 10 days to make it a habit. So if we look closer at the habit formation hypothesis, what this means is that participation in physical activity, it's not only based on planned behavior, but it's done almost automatically. A habit is something that's done automatically without too much thinking behind it. And in order to form a habit, we've got to do a lot of repetition of the behavior is required. However, we don't really know too much about the tracking of habits from a young age to adulthood. And that makes it pretty hard to estimate the importance of this habit formation hypothesis as a possible explanation for the tracking of physical activity. We saw previously that inactivity actually tracks better than physical activity. It may be that being inactive is a more powerful habit than being physically active. Okay, so finally we have the self-selection hypothesis. This suggests that individuals who have a hereditary disposition to physical fitness, do more physical activity in childhood and adulthood. Basically, it's saying that if you're good at something, you're more likely to do it. So we know that physical fitness, it's genetically determined to an extent. So family and twin studies have shown high to moderate genetic influences on sport participation and physical activity. And although it's evident that genes regulate our physical capacity and fitness to a pretty large degree, it's probably only explains a part of physical activity behavior. We can't blame it all on our genetic predisposition. So some key points from this part of the lecture: we saw that physical activity, it's somewhat associated with adult physical activity, but it's a pretty low to moderate effect. So we wouldn't be confident in saying that active kids become active adults. We saw that there's actually a stronger association between inactivity in youth and inactivity in adulthood compared to physical activity across the lifespan. And we also know that adult physical activity, it's a complex behavior. It's not going to be influenced just by how active we are in our youth, but also by things like our socio-demographics, environmental influences, personal and behavioral variables as well. All right, now we're finally onto pathway B of our conceptual model. So pathway B demonstrates the influence of physical activity during childhood on morbidity during childhood. And the most prevalent morbidity issue in this age group is overweight and obesity. So over the next few slides, we're going to discuss the prevalence and the health consequences of overweight and obesity among children and infants. So in 2017 and 18 in Australia, 67% of children aged 5 to 14 were a normal weight, so a bit over half. However, it was a quarter of children in Australia who are overweight or obese, so 17% being overweight and 7% being obese. Now, in this age group, there's no real difference between boys and girls. They both had the same prevalence, and these figures have generally been stable since around 2008. So this could sort of be seen as a good thing because over a 10-year period, we haven't gotten any worse, but it's still pretty bad. So is the prevalence of overweight and obesity the same for everyone? Well, the answer to that is no. Now, in 2018, more children were overweight or obese if they lived in a one-parent family compared to children in two-parent families. If a child had a disability, they were more likely to have excess body weight. And those that live in regional and remote areas were more likely to be overweight compared to those in major cities. Also, those in lower socioeconomic areas were at a disadvantage as well. So children in these disadvantaged families are typically at a higher risk of overweight and obesity compared to children from less disadvantaged families from higher socioeconomic areas. And a review study by Simmons aimed to address whether children and adolescent obesity is actually predictive of adult obesity. So obese children and adolescents were around 5 times more likely to be obese in adulthood compared to those who were not obese as a child. So around 55% of obese children go on to be obese in adolescence, and around 80% of obese adolescents will still be obese in adulthood. Therefore, the action to reduce and prevent obesity in children and adolescents is really required. If we can reduce the amount of overweight children and overweight adolescents, hopefully that will mean a reduction in the number of overweight adults. However, a really interesting finding from this study was actually that 70% of obese adults were not actually obese in childhood or adolescence. So targeting obesity reduction just at children or just at adolescents needs to be considered carefully, because this is not going to substantially reduce the overall burden of adult obesity, given that 70% of the people who are obese adults weren't actually obese as children. So what causes overweight and obesity in children? Generally, it results from a sustained energy imbalance. So where the amount of energy that a child consumes through eating and drinking outweighs the energy that they expend through physical activity and other bodily functions. So some of the behaviors that can cause an imbalance between intake and expenditure include things like increasing consumption of energy-dense, low-nutrient foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, insufficient physical activity, increased sedentary activity, time in front of screens, and also insufficient sleep. There's also other important environmental and social factors which increase the likelihood of a child gaining excess weight. These include things like genetic differences, accessibility to fresh food, and access to safe outdoor play areas. Now, environmental factors actually play a pretty large role in the prevalence of obesity. At the same time that we've introduced kids to all of these sedentary distractors, they've got TVs, electronics, iPads, video games. We've also removed the demand for physical activity in many parts of our lives, and we can see that here. Now, in the 1970s, walking and riding your bike to school were the most common way that children commuted. And by the early 2000s, kids actively making their way to school had declined dramatically. Now, this decrease in the amount of kids walking or riding their bike to school was mirrored by a simultaneous rise in driving to school. So this decrease in the walking or biking, it really represents a pretty big, important loss of everyday physical activity for children and adolescents. And this could be just one part of the reason that we have high rates of childhood obesity. Now, unfortunately, there's many negative health consequences of childhood obesity, and this figure nicely displays the interaction between the negative health outcomes of childhood obesity. So children with obesity, they have a higher risk of experiencing hypertension, insulin resistance, and early markers of cardiovascular disease. And in addition to physical health problems, children with overweight and children who are obese can often experience teasing or bullying, which can have a pretty large impact on their psychological well-being, their peer relationships, school experience, and their self-confidence. So prevention is the key to success for obesity control. We know that many, but not all, obese children will eventually become obese adults. So the management of obesity in adulthood is very difficult, and it's often unsuccessful. If you try and help someone lose weight in adulthood, it's a very difficult task. But the prevention of childhood obesity can be more successful, and it can provide a good chance for reducing long-term negative health complications. So there's 3 levels of prevention in dealing with childhood obesity. The primordial prevention deals with keeping a healthy weight and normal BMI throughout childhood and into adolescence. Primary prevention aims to prevent overweight children from becoming obese. And then secondary prevention is directed towards the treatment of obesity to reduce possible comorbidities and reverse the obesity if possible. So primordial, we're trying to not let them get overweight. In primary prevention, if they're overweight, we're trying to keep them from becoming obese. And in secondary prevention, we're trying to help them lose weight or reduce possible negative health outcomes. Including health practices like increasing fruit and veg consumption, as well as the inclusion of exercise and active lifestyles should form the pillar of any obesity prevention program. And obesity and overweight, we know that they're largely preventable. The World Health Organization makes some general recommendations for the prevention of obesity in infants and young children. These include things like the early initiation of breastfeeding and continuing breastfeeding for the first 6 months of life, and then introducing other foods at 6 months together with continued breastfeeding for up to 2 years of age. For school-aged children, the World Health Organization recommends limiting energy intake from fats and sugars, increasing fruit and veg consumption, and engaging in regular exercise and physical activity. So overall, we've seen that 25% of children in Australia are overweight or obese, and these obese children are likely to remain obese in adulthood. However, the majority of obese adults weren't actually obese in childhood. So we need to focus our prevention of obesity on children as well as on adults. Now, the overarching mechanism of childhood obesity is positive energy balance, but this is influenced by many behavioral, environmental, and social factors. Now, there's serious health consequences of childhood obesity, such as hypertension and insulin resistance, which can lead to cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes and death in later life. All right, so we've gone through the guidelines and physical activity trends in infants and children, and we've spoken about that pathway A and pathway B of our conceptual model of physical activity and health throughout the lifespan.